People say love makes you blind, but arrogance is the real blindfold. You spend your youth building a launch pad for the man you love, never expecting him to leave you in the ashes. When he stumbled home high that night, sneering at my life, he thought I would crumble. He forgot one crucial detail. The person who builds the foundation knows exactly where the load-bearing pillars are and how to burn the entire building down with a single spark. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Caroline Robertson. I am 32 years old, and I work as the Director of Operations at Vanguard Horizon Logistics. While the company itself is a fictional entity in the grand scheme of the shipping industry, the relentless pace and the bone-deep exhaustion it causes are as real as any massive corporate giant here in Seattle. Every single day, I navigate a chaotic maze of delayed cargo ships, broken supply chains, and screaming vendors. It is a grueling, unglamorous job that wrings out every ounce of my mental energy, leaving me entirely hollowed out by the time I commute home through the perpetual gray drizzle of the city. Yet, it pays the bills. It pays for absolutely everything. My husband, Julian, is 34 years old. He is a man blessed with striking good looks, a sharp, structured jawline, and the kind of restless, magnetic ambition that burns bright whenever he walks into a crowded room. We have been together for 7 years, and we have been married for 4 of them, to the outside world. Peering through the pristine windows of our Seattle townhouse, we were the absolute picture of modern, middle-class stability. We possessed the matching cars, the manicured lawn, and the shared, intoxicating dream of building a tech empire from the ground up. But the quiet reality of a marriage is rarely what it appears to be from the safety of the sidewalk. There was a time when our lives were beautifully simple, defined by a shared struggle that felt much more like a romantic adventure than a genuine hardship. I frequently look back on those early days with a bittersweet, suffocating ache in my chest. Our entire existence used to revolve around splitting discounted pepperoni pizzas on a battered thrift store coffee table. I willingly broke my back working double shifts, burying myself under mountains of freight manifests and complex shipping schedules just to keep us afloat. I paid the monthly rent. I paid the utility bills. I managed the crushing weight of our combined student loans. I did all of this gladly, without a single complaint, so that Julian could pour every waking hour and every ounce of his supposed brilliance into developing his supply chain optimization software. It was his ultimate masterpiece, the revolutionary product he proudly swore would change the industry forever. I was the silent, steady engine room, endlessly shoveling coal into the roaring furnace so his majestic ship could sail forward into a brighter future. For a very long time, that unbalanced arrangement worked perfectly for both of us. I have always been a woman who deeply loves stability. I crave the quiet, predictable rhythm of a life well managed. My idea of a flawless Friday night was curling up on our beige living room sofa with a warm fleece blanket, pouring a glass of cheap grocery store wine, and watching a historical documentary play softly on the television. I simply wanted peace. I wanted a safe sanctuary away from the ringing phones and chaotic logistics I dealt with all week. But somewhere along the line, Julian began to change, mutating into someone I barely recognized. The man who used to laugh with me over cold pizza started speaking an entirely different language. He began looking at my Friday night documentaries with a subtle, condescending sneer. He became deeply obsessed with flashy buzzwords that felt entirely alien to our quiet living room. He would pace the hardwood floor, talking aggressively about changing our destiny, breaking into the elite circles, and achieving absolute financial freedom. The humble, honest ambition of building a useful software product rapidly warped into a frantic, greedy hunger for elevated status and immense wealth. He started upgrading his wardrobe, purchasing tailored shirts while I continued to wear the same sensible work suits I had owned for 3 years. Recently, the subtle cracks in our carefully constructed foundation started widening into dangerous, undeniable fissures. Julian's investor pitch meetings, which used to reliably end at a reasonable hour, suddenly began stretching long into the early morning darkness. He would stumble through the front door at 2 or 3 in the morning, smoothly claiming he was out networking with high-profile venture capitalists. He started wearing incredibly expensive, heavy colognes. They were rich, intoxicating scents of rare leather and dark bergamot that aggressively lingered in the hallway air long after he left the house. I managed our finances down to the final penny. I knew exactly what every cent was doing, and I knew for an absolute, undeniable fact that our heavily utilized joint credit cards could not possibly cover luxury fragrances. Then came the suffocating secrecy. The man who used to leave his laptop open on the dining table and his phone casually tossed on the kitchen counter suddenly guarded his electronic devices like highly classified state secrets. I would wake up in the dead of the night, feeling the chill of the empty space beside me, only to find him sleeping soundly with his phone tucked carefully and deliberately underneath his pillow. Despite all the glaring, neon red flags waving violently right in front of my face, I tried desperately to ignore my worsening intuition. I wrapped myself tightly in a heavy blanket of denial. I am a rational woman, a seasoned logistics expert professionally trained to identify and solve complex problems. Yet I deliberately chose to look away from the most destructive problem growing inside my own home. I firmly convinced myself that his growing coldness, his increasingly short temper, and his constant, simmering irritation were simply the natural side effects of extreme professional stress. I told myself over and over, this is just the immense, crushing pressure of a future tech CEO struggling to carve out his rightful place in the cutthroat, unforgiving world of Silicon Valley. I foolishly justified his cruelty as necessary ambition. I rationalized his emotional distance as deep focus. I was so incredibly busy maintaining the perfect, polished facade of our marriage that I stubbornly refused to see the demolition crew already inside, planting the explosives that would tear my entire world apart. The digital clock on the bedside table glowed a harsh red, displaying exactly 3 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday, the violent, metallic scraping of a key aggressively forcing its way into the front door shattered the dead silence of the house. I shot up from the mattress, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. I threw off the blankets and hurried down the dark stairs, bracing myself for whatever late-night emergency had brought him home at this ungodly hour. The heavy oak door swung open, slamming violently against the hallway wall with a deafening crack. Julian stumbled heavily over the threshold, kicking the door shut behind him with the heel of his leather shoe. He did not smell like alcohol. There was no familiar, predictable stench of stale beer or expensive bourbon clinging to his jacket. Instead, his jaw was rigidly locked, clenching and unclenching in rapid, entirely involuntary spasms. He was sweating profusely despite the freezing ambient temperature of the Seattle night, and his eyes were wide, terrifying pools of absolute darkness. His pupils were so massively dilated that his natural eye color was entirely swallowed by black. This was not a drunken stupor. This was the volatile, erratic, and highly dangerous aftermath of incredibly expensive synthetic stimulants rocketing violently through his bloodstream. His usually immaculate designer shirt was violently wrinkled, half unbuttoned, and hanging haphazardly from his shoulders. And right there, aggressively stamped against the crisp white fabric of his collar, was a smeared, undeniable streak of dark crimson lipstick. I walked into the kitchen, my hands trembling slightly, and filled a tall glass with cold water from the refrigerator. I approached him slowly, holding the glass out as a peace offering. "Julian, what is going on? Where have you been?" I asked, my voice tight with an exhausting mixture of dread and confusion. He did not flinch. He did not offer a poorly constructed defensive lie. He did not show a single ounce of panic, remorse, or guilt. Instead, he stared directly into my face for a long, deeply uncomfortable moment, and then he laughed. It was not his usual warm chuckle. It was a loud, sharp, grating bark of pure contempt that echoed viciously off the high ceiling of our living room. It was the mocking, cruel laugh of a complete stranger. With a sudden, violent flick of his wrist, he slapped the glass of water entirely out of my hand. The glass shattered spectacularly against the hardwood floor, sending a loud crash through the house and scattering cold water and jagged shards of glass violently across our feet. "You really have absolutely no idea, do you?" he sneered, his voice buzzing with a frantic, manic, chemically induced energy. "You are standing there in your pathetic, oversized pajamas, asking me where I have been like some nagging mother. I have been with Victoria. Victoria Vance." He practically spat the name out as if it were a royal title I was entirely unworthy to even hear. "She is a 40-year-old angel investor. She is brilliant. She is loaded, and she is going to pump millions of dollars into my company. Millions. Caroline." He staggered forward, aggressively closing the distance between us until I could literally feel the unnatural, feverish heat radiating from his skin. He violently jammed his index finger into my shoulder, physically pushing me back a step. "I am so unbelievably sick of this," he snarled, gesturing wildly and disgustedly at our carefully decorated living room. "I am suffocating in this mediocre, draining, absolutely tedious life with you. Every single day I wake up, I look at you, and what do I see? A woman who buries her face in logistics waybills and shipping containers. You possess zero vision. You possess zero drive. You are so perfectly content being a corporate drone." His eyes were wild, darting erratically around the room as he spoke with an increasing theatrical grandiosity. "Victoria is a goddess," he declared, his voice trembling with a disturbing, obsessive reverence. "She actually understands how the high-level world works. She makes me feel truly alive. She looks at me and she sees a titan. But you—" He let out another harsh, degrading scoff, looking me up and down with raw disgust. "You are just a rusty, heavy anchor chaining me to the absolute bottom of the ocean. You are dragging my greatness down into the mud because you are too small-minded to ever fly." The verbal assault did not stop there. He leaned in closer, his breath hot, rapid, and chemical smelling against my face. He was perfectly eager to inflict maximum psychological damage. "Do you want to know the absolute, brutal truth, Caroline? Touching you lately has been nothing more than a cheap, miserable obligation. Every single time we were intimate over the last few months, I was just closing my eyes and counting down the agonizing minutes. I am simply waiting for the ink to dry on this new venture capital contract. The very second those millions hit my business account, I am handing you divorce papers. You are entirely obsolete." Having expelled all of his toxic venom to artificially elevate his own fractured, monstrous ego, his chemically depleted body finally surrendered. His eyes rolled back slightly, his knees buckled inward, and he collapsed heavily onto the plush living room rug. Within seconds, his erratic breathing slowed into a heavy, rhythmic, ignorant snore. I stood entirely motionless amidst the glittering shards of shattered glass. I looked down at the man sprawled carelessly on the floor, the man I had relentlessly protected, financed, and loved for 7 long years, the man to whom I had sacrificed my vibrant youth and my own career ambitions. A normal wife would have collapsed in agonizing pain. A normal wife would have screamed or sobbed hysterically, or fallen to her knees in crippling, world-shattering despair. But I did not shed a single tear. My tear ducts were completely, unnaturally dry. Instead of shattering into a million pieces like the glass on the floor, a profound, terrifying, and razor-sharp coldness washed over my entire body. It was a suffocating, absolute silence that completely swallowed the chaotic noise in my mind. The warmth of my love, my loyalty, and my devotion died right there on the living room floor. It was instantly replaced by the terrifying, meticulous, and deadly calm of a woman who suddenly understood exactly what needed to be done. I did not pack my clothes. I did not pack my favorite shoes or the sentimental trinkets that decorated our living room shelves, moving with a terrifying absolute precision. I retrieved a single, small black suitcase from the top of the hallway closet. Into it went my birth certificate, my passport, our tax returns, my heavy work laptop, and every single piece of foundational legal paperwork I could locate in his home office. I was no longer a devastated wife packing for a miserable marital separation. I was a forensic auditor aggressively securing critical evidence before a corporate raid. By the time the glowing digital clock on the dashboard struck 4 o'clock in the morning, I was pulling out of the driveway. I drove straight through the empty, rain-slicked streets to the apartment of my best friend, Chloe. I did not offer her a tearful, broken explanation when she opened her door wrapped in her winter robe. I simply asked for her spare bedroom, locked the wooden door behind me, opened my laptop, and began to work. The following day, I entirely severed all emotional communication. I did not send Julian a single word of anger, sorrow, or closure. I called the Human Resources Department at Vanguard Horizon Logistics and requested a 1-week personal leave of absence, briefly citing an abrupt family emergency. Then, I went hunting. I did not want a peaceful mediator. I wanted a bloodthirsty mercenary. I secured the services of the most ruthless, notoriously aggressive divorce attorney in the city. She was a sharply dressed, brilliant woman who treated marriage dissolutions exactly like hostile corporate takeovers. Immediately after handing over my substantial retainer fee, I hired a highly seasoned private investigator, a former police detective who specialized in uncovering the dirty financial and personal filth of the local elite. While the paid professionals began their tactical work, I dove deep into our joint bank accounts. For years, I had generated the primary stable income, but I had blindly trusted Julian to manage our long-term savings while I handled the daily household logistics. It was a catastrophic error, but one I was about to meticulously rectify, line by line, hour after hour. I dissected the financial statements. The truth was glaring, sickening, and entirely undeniable. Our shared savings account, a crucial safety net I had painstakingly built over 4 years of exhausting overtime shifts and skipped vacations, was completely drained. The remaining balance was practically zero. Julian had siphoned the money out in massive, calculated withdrawals, heavily masking them on the ledger under vague labels like business development and client entertainment expenses for his startup. But the itemized transaction histories told the real story. He had used my hard-earned money to purchase diamond tennis bracelets, reserve private dining rooms at Michelin-starred restaurants, and buy extravagant weekend getaways at boutique spa resorts for Victoria. I was literally financing my own husband's glamorous infidelity. By late afternoon, Julian's chemical high had violently crashed, and the frantic bombardment began. My phone screen lit up relentlessly with incoming calls and a desperate, chaotic flood of text messages. His initial tone was fiercely commanding and arrogant. He demanded to know where I had gone, ordering me to come home immediately and act like a rational adult. When I did not answer his aggressive demands, his tone rapidly pivoted to explosive, terrifying rage. He called me vile names, threatening to lock me out of the house and permanently cancel my credit cards. Finally, by the late evening, he resorted to playing the pathetic, broken victim. He left a series of breathless voicemails, crying dramatically into the receiver, blaming the intense, crushing pressure of the tech industry for making him briefly lose his mind. He swore he did not mean a single word he had said the night before, claiming the drugs had completely hijacked his brain. I ignored every single emotional plea, every hollow threat, and every manufactured tear. When I finally decided to respond the next morning, my text message was cold, surgically precise, and completely devoid of any human feeling. I typed, "We will only communicate regarding the legal division of our shared assets. Do not contact me for any other reason." My absolute, chilling indifference drove him completely insane. For 7 years, Julian had relied entirely on my predictable, nurturing reactions. He was deeply accustomed to me panicking, rushing in to soothe his manufactured anxieties, and diligently cleaning up the chaotic messes he left in his wake. My sudden, total transformation into a silent, unmovable wall of ice completely shattered his grand sense of control. He was punching at thick concrete, and it was breaking his knuckles. 2 days later, my phone pinged with a secure, heavily encrypted email from the private investigator. I opened the digital folder while sitting quietly at Chloe's kitchen table, holding a mug of black coffee. The first batch of files contained exactly what I expected. There were high-resolution, time-stamped photographs of Julian and Victoria intimately holding hands, kissing, and walking into the private lobbies of various five-star hotels across the city. But the photographs were merely the appetizer. The real, devastating prize lay in the comprehensive background report attached at the bottom of the email chain. My investigator had dug deep into the financial and personal history of the woman my husband firmly believed was his golden ticket to the elite class. As I read through the highly classified documents detailing Victoria's true identity, her actual financial status, and the real source of her supposed wealth, a slow, dark, and genuinely terrifying smile spread across my face. Julian had sold his soul to a wealthy goddess, but he had entirely failed to research her actual origins. The game was no longer about a simple divorce, it was about absolute annihilation. The private investigator's dossier was an absolute masterpiece of corporate espionage. As I scrolled rapidly through the heavily encrypted digital files on my laptop, the grand illusion of Julian's golden ticket violently disintegrated right in front of my eyes. Victoria Vance was not an independent, self-made angel investor blazing a trail through Silicon Valley. She was entirely a parasite wearing designer clothes. The background report clearly detailed that the massive, intimidating fortune she shamelessly flaunted belonged exclusively to her husband, Marcus Vance. Marcus was not merely wealthy. He was an apex predator in the global financial world. He was a notoriously ruthless billionaire who orchestrated hostile takeovers of vulnerable venture capital firms with terrifying, cold-blooded efficiency. Victoria held absolutely zero executive power within his massive corporate empire. Worse, the millions of dollars she had aggressively promised to inject into Julian's startup did not exist in any legitimate investment portfolio. The financial traces expertly uncovered by my investigator proved without a single shadow of a doubt that she was systematically embezzling cash from an isolated, highly monitored family trust fund. She was stealing directly from a financial titan known for utterly destroying anyone who dared to cross him, and she was using that stolen, radioactive money to buy the affections of my husband. If Marcus ever discovered the missing funds, he would not just serve them with standard legal papers. He would financially, legally, and socially obliterate them both. The sheer magnitude of their combined arrogance and stupidity made my pulse race with an incredible, addictive adrenaline. But the true, lethal kill shot of my revenge did not materialize until the following morning. Sitting inside the sleek, temperature-controlled glass office of my divorce attorney, I sat firmly across the polished mahogany conference table from my lawyer, sliding the heavy stack of foundational business documents I had rescued from the house toward her. Julian had always aggressively paraded around the city, loudly declaring himself a visionary tech founder. He had completely bought into his own manufactured mythology. In his relentless, blinding pursuit of greatness, he had conveniently forgotten the actual, documented history of how his company was born. 4 years ago, Julian was a complete financial ghost. His previous, poorly planned business venture had imploded spectacularly, burying him under a suffocating mountain of bad debt, severe legal liabilities, and a credit score so abysmally low he could not even secure a basic business loan for office supplies. When he finally conceptualized his new supply chain optimization software, he was legally paralyzed. He desperately needed a pristine, untainted financial entity to shield the new project from his aggressive creditors. That was exactly when I stepped in to save him. I did not just sign a standard, supportive spouse waiver. I legally registered the limited liability company entirely under my own name. I was the sole founding legal representative, because I was the one with the flawless credit history and the stable, verifiable corporate income. The foundational paperwork was drafted to heavily favor my ultimate protection. My lawyer rapidly scanned the yellowed legal pages, her sharp eyes widening behind her expensive designer frames. "My God," she said, her voice dropping into a low, genuinely thrilled whisper. "Do you fully understand the absolute gravity of what you are holding here?" I nodded slowly, the exhausting memory of those desperate, early years washing over me. But the corporate structure was only the first, superficial layer of my absolute control. There was a much deeper, far more destructive legal secret hiding inside the core asset of the company itself. Julian was a brilliant salesman and a charismatic visionary, but his actual coding skills were incredibly sloppy and entirely undisciplined. When he was desperately trying to build the working prototype for the routing algorithm, the very heart of the software that made the entire company valuable, he hit a massive, insurmountable wall. The code kept crashing. He spent weeks screaming at his computer screens. Completely paralyzed by a complex mathematical barrier, he simply lacked the technical depth to cross. He had entirely forgotten the woman he actually married, before I willingly surrendered to the steady, grueling world of logistics just to pay our bills. I had graduated at the absolute top of my class with a highly specialized degree in software engineering. My hard-earned diploma was quietly gathering dust in a taped cardboard box in our garage, but my technical skills remained razor-sharp. For 2 agonizing months, while Julian slept soundly in our bed, I stayed awake until the sun came up. I systematically ripped his broken, useless code apart and meticulously rebuilt the core algorithm from the absolute ground up. I wrote the complex mathematical logic. I structured the entire database architecture. I breathed actual, functional life into his hollow, failing idea. And because I am a woman who inherently values order and strict legal protection, I quietly filed the intellectual property and copyright registration for that specific core source code entirely under my own name. I never officially transferred the rights to the company. I simply granted the business a temporary, easily revocable license to use it. My lawyer placed the documents flat on the table, a predatory, victorious smile slowly stretching across her face. "Legally speaking, you are absolutely not a dependent wife waiting around for a standard 50% split of the marital assets in a messy divorce court," she explained, sharply tapping her manicured fingernail against the ownership ledger. "You are the officially registered majority shareholder holding 51% of the equity. You possess absolute, unchecked voting control over the entire board. Furthermore, because you personally hold the indisputable copyright to the core software, the company cannot legally operate, license, or sell the primary product without your explicit written authorization." The reality of the situation hit me like a massive, surging wave of electricity, electrifying every single nerve in my body. Julian had stood in our living room, high on expensive synthetic drugs, declaring me an obsolete, rusty anchor dragging down his soaring tech empire. He had confidently and cruelly planned to toss me aside like garbage the exact moment the stolen venture capital hit his bank account. He was completely blissfully oblivious to his own legal reality. He was not the undisputed king of his own shiny castle. He was merely a temporary, highly expendable puppet chief executive officer that I had generously allowed to play business with my assets. I owned the legal walls. I owned the foundational bedrock. I owned the very code that gave the company its pulse. I did not need to fight him for half of his fake, crumbling empire. I already owned the absolute entirety of it, and I now held the immediate, undeniable legal power to sell it, dismantle it, or burn it straight to the absolute ground without ever asking for his permission. The board was perfectly set. The trap was fully armed, and it was finally time to invite my arrogant husband to his own spectacular execution. I deliberately crafted a text message designed to perfectly execute a psychological surrender. I knew exactly how his mind operated. He needed to feel like a conquering king. I typed out the words with cold, surgical precision, claiming that my spirit was entirely shattered. I told him I was completely exhausted by the constant tension, crying myself to sleep every night, and fundamentally lacked the emotional strength or the financial resources for a prolonged, ugly legal battle in court. I offered a complete, unconditional surrender. I stated I would willingly sign over my entire equity stake in his tech startup for a truly laughable, microscopic buyout of $10,000, simply to escape the waking nightmare and find some quiet peace. He bit the bait faster than a starving animal. His response arrived on my screen less than 3 minutes later. The tone of his message was practically vibrating through the phone with triumphant, unearned condescension. He readily agreed to my pathetic terms, magnanimously suggesting we meet in a neutral public setting to end things amicably, just like rational, sophisticated adults. He selected a hyper-exclusive, heavily guarded French restaurant located right in the heart of the financial district. It was a pretentious place with velvet ropes, strict dress codes, and a legendary 6-month waiting list. I knew the establishment intimately without ever having stepped foot inside. It was the exact same Michelin-starred dining room where he had systematically devoured the last remaining thousands of my emergency savings fund. On the evening of our scheduled meeting, I arrived exactly 20 minutes early. I deliberately dressed for the specific, pathetic role I needed to play. I bypassed my sharp corporate suits and instead wore a slightly faded, shapeless beige wool sweater with simple, unpolished slacks. I wore absolutely no makeup, ensuring my face looked pale and drawn, perfectly embodying the beaten, unglamorous, exhausted corporate drone he so deeply despised. I sat quietly in the corner of our secluded, dimly lit private booth, nursing a simple glass of tap water, waiting patiently for the grand victors to arrive and claim their prize. Precisely at 15 minutes past 6, Julian strolled through the heavy velvet curtains of the private dining room. He looked as though he had just stepped directly off the glossy cover of a billionaire lifestyle magazine. He wore a bespoke, charcoal gray tailored suit that hugged his shoulders perfectly, his hair impeccably styled with expensive pomade. He radiated the sickening, blinding confidence of a man who firmly believed he had just conquered the entire tech universe. But the true, breathtaking masterpiece of his audacity was the person walking right beside him, holding his arm. He had actually brought his wealthy mistress to finalize his marital asset settlement. Victoria strutted into the room, draped in an expensive, flowing emerald silk dress that likely cost more than my first car. She took the plush leather seat directly across from me, elegantly crossing her legs and looking at me as if I were a highly offensive, foul-smelling stain on the pristine white tablecloth. Around her neck, catching the low, romantic ambient light of the restaurant, rested a stunning, intricate diamond tennis necklace. I recognized the piece instantly from my grueling financial audit of his hidden credit card statements. My drained savings account was currently resting beautifully and heavily against her collarbone. A white-gloved waiter silently poured them expensive vintage champagne, which they eagerly accepted without ever once offering me a menu or a drink. "You know," Victoria purred smoothly, taking a delicate, theatrical sip from her crystal flute. She offered a tight, terrifyingly fake smile that never quite reached her cold eyes. "It is truly a profound pity that things had to end up this way for you, but eventually, a woman simply has to understand her natural limitations. You have to know exactly where your place is in the world. Julian is a true visionary. He is destined for the absolute stratosphere of the elite. You were only ever meant to stay safely on the ground, doing the heavy lifting." Julian chuckled, a deep, resonant sound of pure, unadulterated self-satisfaction. He reached into his designer leather briefcase and slid a thick, bound legal folder across the polished mahogany table. The transfer documents. He leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers together, and looked at me with unbearable, patronizing mercy. "I am not a cruel monster," Julian declared, his voice thick with a manufactured, saintly generosity. "I know you worked hard in your own little, quiet way over the past 4 years. I recognize that you tried your best to support me. So, I am going to be incredibly generous with this final settlement. I am leaving you the old Honda. It is completely paid off. You will not have to worry about a stressful car payment while you try to figure out your next steps in life. Consider it a generous parting gift for your loyal service. I looked down at the thick stack of papers. It was the contract that would legally hand him my entire life's work, my code, and my company for absolute pennies. I slowly reached out and picked up the heavy, gold-plated pen resting beside the folder. I forced my hand to shake violently, vibrating with expertly manufactured defeat and overwhelming sorrow. I let out a soft, perfectly pitched, broken sigh, playing the completely crushed, submissive wife, right down to the very last second. But beneath the table, my pulse was as steady and calm as a ticking metronome. I glanced subtly at my wrist. The second hand on my silver watch swept steadily toward the 12. It was exactly 7 o'clock in the evening, the precise, carefully calculated moment I had arranged for a very special, highly anticipated guest to walk through the heavy brass doors of the restaurant. The heavy velvet curtains at the entrance of our private dining booth did not simply part. They were forcefully shoved aside by a massive, impeccably dressed security detail. Julian's smug, victorious smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He half rose from his chair, visibly annoyed, undoubtedly prepared to scold the restaurant staff for allowing a lowly public notary to interrupt his moment of triumph so aggressively. But the man who stepped through the doorway was absolutely no public notary. He was a tall, silver-haired man, radiating an aura of terrifying, quiet authority that immediately sucked all the oxygen out of the room. He wore a dark, custom-tailored suit that commanded instant respect, and his eyes were completely devoid of any human warmth. Flanking him were 3 men carrying heavy leather briefcases, moving with the synchronized, lethal precision of high-priced corporate litigators. Across the mahogany table, Victoria let out a sound that resembled a dying animal. The blood drained so rapidly from her perfectly contoured face that she looked like a freshly embalmed corpse. The arrogant, condescending goddess who had just lectured me about my place in the world was suddenly trembling so violently that the stolen diamonds around her neck clattered softly against her collarbone. "Hello, Victoria," Marcus Vance said. His voice was not a shout. It was a deadly, frozen whisper that commanded total silence. "Did you honestly believe you could siphon money from my family trust without tripping the internal security audits?" Marcus did not wait for his hyperventilating wife to formulate a pathetic lie. He simply nodded to his lead attorney. The lawyer stepped forward and unceremoniously dumped a massive, heavily bound dossier right into the center of the table, knocking over Victoria's crystal champagne flute. The expensive liquid spilled across the white tablecloth like a spreading stain, but nobody moved to wipe it up. The dossier fell open, revealing crystal clear, high-definition photographs of Julian and Victoria entering various luxury hotel suites, but the photographs were the least damaging items in that folder. Plastered on top were highlighted bank statements, wire transfer logs, and undeniable financial proof that the millions of dollars Victoria had promised Julian were stolen directly from an isolated inheritance fund meant for Marcus's children from his first marriage. Julian, completely blinded by his own towering ego, fundamentally misunderstood the absolute danger he was in. He frantically looked between Marcus, the terrifying lawyers, and his panicking mistress, in a display of supreme, almost unbelievable delusion. Julian actually tried to salvage his funding. He stood up, nervously adjusting his designer tie, and held his hands out in a placating, desperate gesture. "Mr. Vance, please, let us all just calm down and look at the bigger picture here," Julian pleaded, his voice cracking slightly as the chemical bravado completely failed him. "Whatever personal issues you have with Victoria, please do not let it ruin a historic business opportunity. My company is on the absolute verge of an industry breakthrough. The software algorithm is flawless. If you just leave the capital investment in my accounts, I can guarantee you an unprecedented return on your money. We are going to be incredibly profitable. Do not pull the plug on a billion-dollar unicorn just because of a misunderstanding." Marcus slowly turned his gaze toward Julian, looking at him with the detached, clinical disgust one might reserve for a cockroach crawling across a dining table. That was my cue. The violent, theatrical shaking in my hand stopped instantly. I placed the heavy gold pen down on the table. The sharp click echoed loudly in the tense, silent room. I leaned back against the plush booth, crossed my arms, and let a slow, terrifyingly genuine smile spread across my face. I reached into my own modest canvas tote bag, pulled out a separate legal document, and tossed it casually onto the spilled champagne, right over Julian's ridiculous transfer papers. "He cannot leave the investment capital in your company, Julian," I said, my voice ringing out clear, steady, and razor-sharp. "And you are not going to be profitable. In fact, you no longer have a company." Julian blinked, his face twisting in genuine, profound confusion. "What are you talking about? Caroline? Just sign the transfer papers and stay out of elite business matters." I looked him dead in the eyes, watching the exact moment the foundation of his entire existence began to crack. "You really should have paid attention to the foundational paperwork 4 years ago. Julian, you are not the founder. You are not the owner. As of this morning, I am the legally recognized majority shareholder holding exactly 51% of the equity. More importantly, I hold the exclusive, undeniable copyright to the core source code of the routing algorithm. You know, the code you were too incompetent to write yourself, so I stayed up all night fixing it for you." His jaw dropped. The color rushed completely out of his face, leaving him looking sickly and gray. "I did not need your permission to make an executive board decision," I continued, savoring every single syllable as it completely dismantled his arrogance. "At 9 o'clock this morning, exercising my absolute legal authority as the majority owner and the sole intellectual property holder, I sold the entire software project, all proprietary data, and the core algorithm to your biggest, most aggressive competitor in the logistics market. I sold it for a massive, heavily verified cash buyout. The money has already cleared my private, protected accounts." Julian stumbled backward, his knees hitting the heavy wooden chair. "You sold it. You cannot do that. That is my life. That is my dream." "It was my code," I corrected him coldly. "And my company, what you currently manage, is an entirely empty, worthless shell corporation holding 0 assets and 0 intellectual property. Furthermore, the money you stole from our joint savings account to buy that necklace for your mistress. My legal team filed a massive injunction for marital fraud yesterday afternoon. Your personal bank accounts, your credit cards, and your pathetic little startup accounts are completely frozen by a federal court order. You possess absolutely nothing." The sheer, crushing weight of reality finally shattered his delusions. His entire tech empire, his grand escape, his elite status, it was all completely vaporized in a matter of seconds. Before Julian could even begin to comprehend the absolute destruction of his life, the pack of wolves turned on each other. Victoria, desperately trying to save herself from her husband's wrath, violently shoved Julian away. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at his chest and began screaming hysterically. She loudly accused Julian of being a manipulative con artist, claiming he had aggressively stalked her, brainwashed her, and manipulated her into taking the money. She threw every single ounce of the blame directly onto his shoulders, publicly humiliating him in front of the man who could destroy them both. Julian tried to shout back, his voice rising in an embarrassing, high-pitched panic as he realized the woman he sacrificed his marriage for was readily throwing him straight into the meat grinder. I did not stay to watch the rest of the pathetic slaughter. I had achieved everything I came to do. I calmly stood up from the table, smoothing out the front of my faded wool sweater. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and placed it neatly next to my untouched glass of tap water to cover the tip. I walked slowly around the table, stopping just inches behind Julian, who was currently hyperventilating and sweating through his bespoke suit. I leaned in incredibly close, letting my lips brush against his ear, and whispered the final words he would ever hear from me. "Being truly great is incredibly expensive. Julian, It is a profound pity you no longer have me here to pay your bills. I turned my back on the chaotic, screaming mess of ruined lives and walked straight out of the heavy velvet curtains. The grand, heavy brass doors of the restaurant swung open, and I stepped out into the freezing, rain-slicked streets of the city. I took a massive, deep breath of the freezing Seattle air. For the very first time in 7 years, my chest did not feel tight. The air felt incredibly crisp, impossibly clean, and fiercely liberating. The following month, I returned to my demanding position at Vanguard Horizon Logistics with a renewed, unbreakable focus. I was rapidly promoted to Senior Vice President of Operations. I moved into a stunning high-rise apartment overlooking the water, funded entirely by the massive buyout from my software sale. My ex-husband is currently drowning in insurmountable legal debt, facing severe criminal charges from Marcus Vance's legal team, and completely blacklisted from every single tech incubator in the country. People often mistakenly believe that the greatest peace you can find in life is successfully holding a broken marriage together, but they are entirely wrong. The greatest, most profound peace you will ever experience is finally recognizing your own immeasurable worth, taking your power back, and building a titanium fortress around your life so that absolutely no one can ever trample on you again. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Zoe Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.